My name is Alice. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my career, I've worked in corporate sales, specifically in enterprise partnerships, where conversations can quietly decide the fate of contracts worth more than most houses. If you met me in a meeting room, you probably wouldn't notice me first. I'm usually the one sitting slightly to the side of the table, laptop open, listening more than talking, taking notes while everyone else debates strategy. People often assume I'm the quiet support person, the one who organizes follow ups, the one who prepares slides, the one who keeps things running while louder voices take the spotlight. And to be fair, for a long time, I let them believe that. Not because I didn't have opinions, not because I lacked confidence, but because I've always believed that the most important parts of communication happen in the space where people aren't trying to prove themselves. In my department, though, silence didn't always read as confidence. Sometimes it was interpreted as weakness. My boss, Daniel, had a habit of saying that out loud, not in cruel, dramatic ways. Nothing that would make HR nervous, just small comments, often wrapped in humor. Let's have someone else handle the client call. Alice is better behind the scenes. She's not exactly our strongest communicator. At first, I assumed he was joking. Later, I realized he wasn't. Over time, those comments became a kind of quiet reputation that followed me through the office. If something needed organizing, it went to me. If something required careful documentation, it went to me. But if a deal required confidence, persuasion, or client trust, apparently that wasn't supposed to be my territory. The strange part is that I never argued about it. Not publicly, not emotionally, not even privately most of the time. Because in the kind of work we did, results speak louder than explanations. And results take time. For months, Daniel continued telling people I was terrible with clients. Then something happened that none of us expected. A $3 million contract, one Daniel had been chasing for almost a year, collapsed in less than 24 hours. Calls were made, meetings were scheduled, apologies were attempted, but the client refused to speak with anyone, except me. That moment didn't feel dramatic when it happened. There was no applause, no realization that something important had shifted. Just a quiet request from a frustrated executive. We'll only continue this conversation if Alice is the one handling it. And suddenly, the person who had spent months questioning my communication skills was asking me to fix the biggest deal of his career. This story isn't about revenge. There are no shouting matches, no dramatic confrontations. It's about something quieter than that. It's about what happens when people decide who you are, before they've actually listened to you. And what happens when circumstances finally give you the chance to respond. Not with arguments, but with clarity. Because sometimes the loudest correction doesn't come from proving someone wrong. Sometimes it comes from simply doing the work, while everyone else watches their assumptions fall apart. But before we get there, you need to understand how this all started. So let me ask you something first. Have you ever been placed into a role in someone else's mind and realized they had already decided who you were before you ever had a chance to show them? If you had asked anyone in my office who I was, the answers would have sounded surprisingly consistent. Alice keeps things organized. She's reliable. She's great with documentation. And almost always, somewhere in the conversation, she's not really a client-facing person. It wasn't said with cruelty. Not most of the time. In fact, the tone people used when they said it was usually polite, almost appreciative. Like someone describing a dependable piece of furniture. Useful, stable, quiet, replaceable. Our office sat on the 23rd floor of a glass building overlooking downtown Seattle, the kind of place designed to feel impressive the moment clients walk through the doors. Clean lines, polished conference tables, soft gray carpeting that muted footsteps. Inside that environment, personality often became a kind of currency. Some people were valued for their energy, some for their confidence, some for how easily they filled a room with their voice. I had never been that kind of presence. When meetings became heated, I listened. When people spoke over each other, I wrote things down. When clients hesitated before answering a question, I noticed the pause. None of those things were particularly visible skills, but they mattered more than most people realize. My job title, Senior Client Operations Specialist, sounded technical enough that no one questioned why I was always present during important calls. Officially, I handled coordination, ensuring contracts were correct, timelines were documented, and deliverables were tracked. Unofficially, I was often the person quietly keeping conversations from collapsing. If a client seemed confused about a pricing structure, I would send a follow-up email clarifying the details before anyone had to ask. If an executive misunderstood part of a proposal, I'd adjust the next presentation so the issue would be resolved without confrontation. Most of the time, those small corrections happened invisibly, which meant people rarely associated them with me. Daniel, my boss, was the opposite kind of presence. He spoke quickly, confidently, often with the energy of someone who believed momentum itself could close deals. In many ways, he was good at what he did. Clients liked enthusiasm, they liked confidence, and Daniel had plenty of both. What he didn't have much patience for was quiet. The first time I noticed his opinion of me becoming public, it happened during a team strategy meeting. One of the junior account managers had suggested I join a client presentation the following week. The client had asked several detailed questions about integration timelines, something I had been managing for months. Before I could respond, Daniel smiled in that easy, casual way he used when dismissing something. "Let's keep Alice in the background on this one," he said lightly. "She's great at operations, but she's not exactly our strongest communicator." The room chuckled politely, not because it was funny, because moments like that create a strange social gravity. People follow the tone set by whoever holds authority. I didn't correct him. There wouldn't have been any benefit. Instead, I opened my notebook and wrote down the client's name again at the top of the page, even though it was already written there from 3 previous meetings. Old habit. Writing things down helps me think clearly. It also helps me notice patterns, and over the next few months, a pattern became impossible to ignore. Whenever something required precision, it came to me. Whenever something required visibility, it went somewhere else. Daniel began repeating the same description often enough that it almost sounded official. Alice isn't really client-facing. She's better behind the scenes. Communication isn't her strongest skill. Each comment was small. Individually, they were easy to dismiss. But reputations aren't usually built in one moment. They're built by repetition. Soon, new hires began treating the idea as fact. When someone needed help preparing for a client meeting, they came to my desk for notes and background information. Then they presented the material themselves. I never stopped them, partly because it didn't bother me as much as people might expect, and partly because the clients behaved very differently. They didn't see the office politics. They only saw the person who answered their emails at 11 at night when an integration failed, the person who remembered their CFO's concerns about compliance, the person who asked careful questions instead of rushing toward a sale. In other words, they saw me. But inside the office, the narrative stayed simple. Alice was quiet. Alice was useful. Alice just wasn't someone you trusted to handle the room. And for a long time, I let them believe that. People often imagine workplace turning points as dramatic moments, a shouting match, a confrontation in a conference room, some clear line where everything changes. In reality, the moments that shape how people see you are usually much smaller. So small that most of the room doesn't even notice them. For me, the first one happened on a Tuesday morning. I remember because Tuesday was our weekly client pipeline review, the meeting where everyone gathered in the long glass conference room and walked through active deals. Daniel stood at the front, controlling the screen while we moved through slides showing projected revenue. When we reached the Westbridge account, a company negotiating a contract worth just under $900,000, he paused. "That one's been tricky," he said, leaning against the table. "They keep circling back to integration concerns." I looked down at my notebook. Westbridge had emailed 3 questions the night before. I had already drafted answers. The integration issue wasn't technical, it was timing. Their internal IT team was worried our rollout would conflict with a software migration they had planned for the same quarter. There was a simple adjustment we could propose. I raised my hand slightly. "Actually," I said calmly, "their concern isn't the integration itself. It's the timeline overlap with their internal migration. If we move the onboarding phase by about 3 weeks," Daniel laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to interrupt the sentence. "Alice," he said, still smiling, "let's not get too deep in the weeds here. The issue is communication. They're just nervous about the change." The room nodded, the slide moved on, and the meeting continued. From the outside, it probably looked like a normal moment in a fast-paced discussion. Managers redirect conversations all the time. But something about the way it happened stayed with me. Not because I was embarrassed, because I was correct. Later that afternoon, Westbridge replied to my email. Their exact words were simple. If onboarding could begin in July instead of June, the rest of the proposal looks workable. 3 weeks, exactly what I had been trying to say. I forwarded the message to Daniel with a short note. Looks like timeline adjustment should resolve their concern. He replied 10 minutes later. Great catch. Let's present that option tomorrow. No mention of the meeting, no acknowledgement that the solution had already been on the table. And to be honest, I didn't expect one. Because by that point, I was beginning to understand something about how professional reputations operate. Once someone defines your role in their mind, everything you do gets filtered through that expectation. If Daniel saw me as operational support, then even useful insights would appear as background information, not a strategy. That afternoon, while the office slowly quieted and people started leaving for the day, I sat at my desk reviewing the Westbridge notes again. Not because the deal required it, because I was thinking about the moment in the meeting, the laugh, the interruption. The quick redirection told the entire room whose voice mattered. Individually, moments like that are easy to dismiss. You tell yourself the manager was just keeping the meeting on track. You tell yourself it wasn't personal. You tell yourself there will be other opportunities to speak. Most people move on. But I've always had a habit of remembering small things, especially patterns. And that moment, small as it was, felt like the beginning of one. Not a dramatic conflict, not even something anyone else would bring up later. Just a quiet correction to the invisible hierarchy in the room. Daniel spoke, others supported, and I provided information, behind the scenes, exactly where everyone seemed to think I belonged. At the time, I still believed something simple. If the work was solid enough, eventually people would notice. What I didn't realize yet was that recognition doesn't always come from being right. Sometimes it only arrives when circumstances make ignoring you impossible. But that would come much later. For now, it was just a small moment in a Tuesday meeting, one that no one else in the room remembered. Except me. The strange thing about small moments of dismissal is how quickly they become normal. Not all at once, but gradually, almost quietly, until no one questions them anymore. After the Westbridge meeting, nothing changed on the surface. I still joined the same client calls. I still prepared the same documentation. I still sat in the same seat during weekly reviews, and Daniel continued speaking about me in the same careful, casual way. Never insulting, just defining. Alice will coordinate the follow-up. She'll handle the background work. She's not really the one for the conversation part. The language was always polite. That's the part people often misunderstand about professional environments. Disrespect rarely arrives in obvious forms. It shows up wrapped in compliments, reliable, organized, behind the scenes. If you hear it often enough, it becomes difficult to tell whether you're being appreciated or quietly limited. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. In some ways, it even felt comfortable. Being the quiet one meant fewer confrontations, fewer expectations to perform in front of large groups, fewer moments where every word you said was being judged. I could focus on what I did best, understanding the details that others overlooked. And in fairness, Daniel didn't exclude me entirely. He often asked for my analysis after meetings ended. He'd stop by my desk and say things like, "What did you think about that client?" "You usually catch things we miss," I answered honestly, because the clients mattered more to me than the internal dynamics of the office. But over time, the pattern became clearer. In private conversations, my observations were valuable. In public conversations, they were unnecessary. One afternoon illustrated this better than anything else. We were preparing for a quarterly review with a healthcare technology company called Halbrook System. The deal was significant, around $1.6 million across 3 years. For 2 weeks, I had been tracking their internal discussions through email threads and small clues in their responses. Something felt uncertain, not hostile, not negative, just cautious. During our prep meeting, Daniel ran through the presentation slides quickly. Revenue projections, implementation schedule, success metrics, everything looked impressive, but something important was missing. "They're still worried about data transition," I said quietly when the room paused. Daniel glanced up from the laptop. "Not really," he replied. "They signed off on that weeks ago." "They signed off on the documentation," I said. "But the CTO asked twice last week whether the migration process could be staged instead of all at once." He shook his head slightly. "That's just technical curiosity. The real decision makers are already comfortable. The room moved on, and once again, I said nothing else. Not because I doubted my observation, because I had already learned something important about those meetings. Correcting someone in authority, even gently, rarely changes their position in the moment. Later that week, during the client call, the Halbrook CTO spoke for about 15 minutes in the conversation. His tone was careful. "Before we finalize anything," he said, "I'd like to revisit the migration structure. Our internal team is still nervous about moving everything simultaneously." There was a brief silence on our side of the call. Daniel glanced at me. Not an accusation, more like sudden recognition. I had mentioned this already. The conversation eventually recovered. We proposed a phased rollout, and the client seemed satisfied. After the call ended, Daniel walked past my desk. "You were right about the CTO," he said. "Good instincts." Then he continued toward his office. Again, it wasn't cruel, but something about the pattern had become unmistakable. My insights existed. They were acknowledged. They just didn't exist in the places where perception formed. The meetings, the presentations, the rooms where reputations are quietly built. By that point, even some of my coworkers had absorbed the narrative. One of the newer account managers once told a client, half jokingly during a meeting, "Alice is our quiet genius behind the curtain." Everyone laughed. It sounded like praise, but the phrase behind the curtain stayed with me, because it perfectly described the role that had been assigned to me: visible enough to be useful, invisible enough to remain safe, and for a long time, I accepted it. Partly because arguing would have required energy, I preferred to spend it on the actual work, and partly because something about the situation felt unfinished, like a story that hadn't reached the moment where the real meaning becomes clear. At that stage, I didn't know what that moment would look like, but I had started to notice something important. The more people assumed I wasn't paying attention, the easier it became to quietly understand everything happening in the room. And that kind of position, observing without being fully noticed, can become surprisingly powerful if you know how to use it. At some point, every workplace quietly assigns you a role, not the one written in your job description, the one person you expect to perform. By the time I had been at the company for 3 years, mine had become very clear. I was the reliable one, the person who remembered details others forgot, the one who stayed calm when a client sent a frustrated email at 6:45 p.m., the one who could rewrite a proposal at midnight if a deal needed rescuing before the next morning's meeting. It sounds flattering when you describe it that way, but there was another side to it. Reliable people are rarely the ones people picture leading the conversation. They're the ones making sure the conversation works. That difference became obvious during one particular project. We had just secured a meeting with a logistics company in Denver. The deal wasn't enormous, about $750,000, but it had potential to grow into a long-term partnership. Daniel gathered the team in the conference room to plan the presentation. "We need energy on this one," he said, clicking through the draft slides. "They're comparing us with two other vendors." He turned to Ryan, one of our newer account managers. "Ryan, you'll lead the call." Ryan looked pleased, but also slightly nervous. "Sure," he said. "Alice, can you help me prep the details?" "Of course," I said. That part wasn't unusual. Over the next 3 days, Ryan and I worked through the entire structure of the pitch. We reviewed the client's previous vendors. We mapped out the pricing questions they were likely to ask. We adjusted the onboarding timeline based on the size of their operations team. Most of the ideas in the final presentation came from those sessions. But when the actual meeting happened, my role was different. The call began with introductions. Ryan spoke first, confidently walking through the company overview. Daniel joined in when the conversation moved toward long-term strategy. I remained silent unless someone addressed me directly. About halfway through the meeting, the client's operations director asked a complicated question about system compatibility. Ryan hesitated. It was a technical issue we had discussed the night before. I waited a moment. Then I said calmly, "If it helps, the compatibility concern usually comes down to the data formatting step. We can stage that separately before the main integration, which reduces most of the risk." There was a brief pause. Then the client nodded. "That's exactly what we were worried about." The conversation moved on. Later, after the meeting ended, Ryan stopped by my desk. "Thanks for jumping in there," he said. "I almost blanked on that question." "No problem," I replied. He smiled. "You should honestly lead more of those calls. You explain things better than most of us." I appreciated the comment, but neither of us expected that to happen. Because by then, the pattern had already settled into place. Preparation happened with me. Execution happened somewhere else. It wasn't something anyone announced, just an arrangement that made the office feel efficient. Daniel once summarized it in a way that was meant as a compliment. We were reviewing a particularly complex proposal late one evening when he leaned back in his chair and said, "You're the backbone of this department, Alice." I looked up from my notebook. He continued, "Every team needs someone who keeps everything together behind the scenes." Behind the scenes, there it was again. The phrase sounded respectful, but it carried a quiet assumption that some people are meant to stand in the light and some people are meant to hold the structure up from the shadows. At the time, I didn't argue with that idea, partly because I had grown used to the role, and partly because I had started noticing something interesting about the position it gave me. When you're not the center of attention in a room, people speak more freely around you. They assume you're focused on logistics instead of listening carefully. They reveal concerns they might hide from someone they see as a negotiator. Clients do this all the time. Small comments during casual conversations. Questions are asked after the official meeting has ended. Details that don't appear in presentations, but reveal what they actually care about. Over the years, I had collected hundreds of those small observations. That's why my green notebook had become so important. Inside it were notes that most people in the office never saw. Not secrets, just patterns. Which clients valued stability over speed? Which executives responded badly to pressure? Which companies hesitated before making large commitments? Those details rarely looked dramatic, but they quietly shaped the outcome of deals. Still, none of that changed how the office saw me. In the internal hierarchy, my position was stable, reliable, supportive, invisible in the places where reputation forms. And for a long time, I allowed that arrangement to continue. Because I believe something simple. If you do your work carefully enough, eventually the right moment will arrive. The moment when preparation and opportunity meet. The moment when the role people assigned you no longer matches the reality in front of them. At that stage, I didn't know when that moment would come, but I had started to feel that it was getting closer, quietly, almost invisibly, just like most important shifts do. Most changes don't begin with a decision. They begin with a moment that makes you look at the same situation slightly differently. For me, that moment happened on a Thursday afternoon. Nothing dramatic was happening in the office that day. No major meetings, no urgent client issues, just the quiet rhythm of people finishing emails before the end of the week. I was reviewing documentation for a large proposal Daniel had been working on for months. The client was a financial services company based in Chicago. The potential contract was just over $3 million, easily the largest deal our department had attempted that year. Daniel had been leading the negotiations personally, which made sense. Big deals were always tied closely to leadership visibility. Executives liked seeing confident, decisive salespeople guiding the process. From the outside, everything looked like it was progressing smoothly. But as I read through the email thread between Daniel and the client's procurement team, something didn't feel quite right. It wasn't the numbers, it wasn't the technical requirements, it was the tone. After years of working with enterprise clients, you start to recognize subtle shifts in how people write. Shorter responses, more formal language. Questions that sound simple but hint at deeper uncertainty. The Chicago client, Harrington Financial, had begun asking those kinds of questions. Not confrontational, just cautious. At one point in the thread, their director of partnerships had written, "We want to make sure the implementation timeline reflects the operational realities on our side." It was a polite sentence, but I had seen something similar before. Clients write that when they feel pressured, when the deal is moving faster than their internal teams are comfortable with. I leaned back in my chair and looked across the office. Daniel was standing near the window, speaking with two account managers, explaining the projected revenue numbers from the Harrington deal. Everyone looked optimistic, excited even. $3 million changes how people behave in a sales department. Bonuses, promotions, recognition from leadership, momentum. But the email thread in front of me told a quieter story, one that didn't match the confidence in the room. A few minutes later, Daniel walked past my desk. "Everything looking good on the documentation?" he asked. "Yes, Chess," I said. "The proposal structure is solid." He nodded. "Great. We're presenting final terms early next week. After that, it should just be paperwork." I hesitated for a second. Then I added calmly, "The client sounds slightly cautious in their last few messages." Daniel glanced at the screen but didn't sit down. "They're just being careful," he said. "It's a big contract. I think they might want more flexibility in the rollout schedule." He smiled in that familiar way. "Alice, you worry too much about client tone. They already agreed to the framework." Then he gave a friendly pat on the desk. "Trust me on this one." And just like that, the conversation ended. Again, it wasn't rude. It wasn't dismissive in a way that would make anyone uncomfortable. But something about that moment stayed with me after he walked away. Because it wasn't the first time I had noticed a shift that others ignored. And more importantly, it wasn't the first time my observation had been gently set aside. I looked down at the green notebook beside my keyboard. For a few seconds, I just stared at the cover. Then I opened it and wrote a single sentence on the next empty page. "Harrington Financial. Client hesitation is increasing." Underneath it, I added 3 smaller notes. "Concern about implementation pressure. Language is becoming more formal. Decision may not be fully aligned internally." Writing it down didn't change anything immediately. The deal was still moving forward. Daniel was still confident. The office still believed the contract was almost secured. But for the first time, I noticed something different happening inside my own thinking. Not frustration, not resentment, just distance. A quiet recognition that my role in the office might not need to stay exactly the way it had been defined, because if the Harrington deal continued the way it was currently moving, there was a very real possibility that something would break. And if that happened, the person everyone believed was terrible with clients might end up being the only one who understood what the client was actually worried about. At the time, that thought didn't feel important, just a small shift in perspective. But looking back now, that was the exact moment the story began to change. After that Thursday, something subtle changed in the way I moved through the office. Not in a way anyone else would notice, but in the way I listened. Before, my silence had mostly been a habit, a way of keeping meetings efficient and avoiding unnecessary tension. If someone dismissed a point I raised, I usually let it pass. It simply wasn't worth turning every observation into a debate. But after reviewing the Harrington emails, my quiet started to feel different, more deliberate. I still attended the same meetings, sat in the same chair along the side of the conference table, opened the same dark green notebook. Daniel continued presenting the Harrington deal as if everything were already settled. "The client's aligned," he told the team one morning. "We're basically finalizing paperwork." No one questioned it. Why would they? From the outside, the deal looked solid. But during those meetings, I began noticing things more carefully. The way Daniel summarized client conversations, the parts he emphasized, the details he skipped over. Every once in a while, I recognized a small mismatch between what he said in the room and what I had seen in the email threads. Not lies, just optimism, the kind that often appears when a deal becomes emotionally important to the person leading it. A few times I considered speaking up again. Then I remembered the pattern. The laugh in the Westbridge meeting, the redirection during Halbrook, the quiet way my comments usually moved the conversation nowhere, so I made a different decision. Instead of trying to correct the room, I simply kept listening. When someone asked about implementation timelines, I wrote down the question. When Daniel described the client as fully confident, I made a small note beside it. And when new emails arrived from Harrington Financial, I read them carefully, sometimes twice, not because I was trying to prove anything, just because I had learned something useful about silence. Most people interpret it as agreement. They assume the quiet person in the room either doesn't have an opinion or doesn't understand the conversation. And sometimes, that assumption can be surprisingly powerful, because when people believe you're not influencing the situation, they stop guarding their words around you. They speak more freely, they reveal their expectations, their plans, their blind spots. And over the next few weeks, as the Harrington deal moved closer to what everyone believed would be the final signature, those small observations started forming a clearer picture, one that almost no one else in the office seemed to see. But I did, quietly, page by page in my notebook. In most offices, people assume preparation looks obvious: late nights, visible effort. Someone announces that they're working on something important. But the kind of preparation I had been doing for years was quieter than that. It looked like normal work: answering emails, updating documents, joining meetings where I said very little. No one noticed how carefully I listened when clients spoke informally after calls ended, or how often I reread email threads, not just for information, but for tone. The Harrington deal slowly became another one of those quiet files in my notebook. Every time their team wrote something slightly cautious, I made a note. Not dramatic observations, just patterns. Questions about rollout pressure, concern about internal IT readiness. Procurement is asking for small clarifications twice. None of these were deal-breaking problems, but together, they suggested something important. Harrington wasn't fully comfortable yet. Meanwhile, inside the office, the narrative had already been decided. Daniel spoke about the deal with increasing certainty. Once this closes, it'll be the biggest contract we've signed this year. The team started planning around it. Forecast spreadsheets updated, revenue projections adjusted, celebration jokes quietly circulating. And through all of it, my role remained exactly the same. I coordinated documents, tracked implementation details, answered occasional technical questions from the client's operations team. From the outside, nothing about my position looked different, but something important was happening underneath that routine. Because while Daniel focused on closing the deal, I had slowly become the person Harrington's operational staff spoke with most often, not through formal presentations, through small messages, clarifications about timelines, questions about how flexible the onboarding process could be. They didn't treat those conversations like negotiations. They treated them like practical discussions with someone who understood the details, which meant they spoke honestly. And honesty, especially in large contracts, is often more valuable than enthusiasm. By the time the proposal was almost finalized, I understood something that most of the room did not. The deal wasn't failing, but it was fragile. If pressure increased even slightly, the client might step back. Not because they disliked the product, because they felt rushed. That realization didn't make me anxious. It just made the situation clearer. And clarity has a strange effect. Once you see the real structure of a problem, you stop feeling the need to argue about it. You simply wait for the moment when the truth becomes visible to everyone else. And sometimes, that moment arrives faster than anyone expects. The moment when everything became clear didn't happen in a meeting. It happened through an email. Late one evening, long after most people had left the office, a message from Harrington Financial appeared in my inbox. It wasn't addressed to the whole team, just to me. The sender was Laura Chen, their director of operations. We had exchanged several practical emails over the past few weeks about implementation logistics, small things, scheduling questions, data migration steps, but this message felt different. Shorter, more direct, she wrote, Alice, before next week's final call, I want to be honest about something. Our internal team still feels the rollout schedule is too aggressive. We've mentioned it a few times, but the responses we're getting seem focused on closing the contract quickly. I read the message twice, not because it was surprising, because it confirmed exactly what the earlier patterns had suggested. The client wasn't rejecting the deal, they just didn't feel heard. Laura continued in the next paragraph. To be transparent, several people here trust your explanations more than the sales presentations. If the timeline could be adjusted, we'd feel much more comfortable moving forward. That sentence stayed with me for a long time, not as validation, as clarity. Because in one quiet message, the entire situation revealed itself. Inside our office, the deal was being treated as almost finished. But inside the client's organization, the decision was still fragile. And more importantly, they were no longer directing their concerns to Daniel. They were directing them to me. I closed my laptop for a moment and sat back in my chair. The office lights were dim by then. Cleaning staff is moving quietly down the hallway. There was no excitement in that realization, no sense of victory, just a calm understanding of something important. For months, I had been described as someone who wasn't good with clients. Yet the client now trusted me enough to speak honestly about the risk that could collapse the entire contract. I opened the green notebook and wrote a single line under the Harrington entry. Client trusts operational honesty more than sales pressure. Then I added another sentence beneath it. If this deal breaks, they will come back to the person they trust. That wasn't a prediction, just a logical outcome. And for the first time since the Harrington negotiations began, I realized something quietly powerful. If the situation unfolded the way it was currently moving, the most important conversation in this entire deal might eventually happen with the one person everyone believed shouldn't be leading client conversations. Not because I planned it, simply because the client had already decided who they felt comfortable speaking with. And sometimes, that decision matters more than any internal title. After Laura's email, the situation felt very clear. Not urgent, not dramatic, just balanced on a quiet edge. On one side, the Harrington deal was moving toward what everyone in our office believed would be a routine closing call the following week. On the other side, I knew something the room didn't fully understand yet. The client wasn't rejecting us, but they were close to stepping back if the pressure continued. That left me with a decision. I could forward Laura's message directly to Daniel and explain the situation. That would have been the obvious move. But I already knew how that conversation would likely unfold. Daniel believed the deal was almost complete. If he suddenly saw hesitation from the client, his instinct would probably be to push harder, reassure them, convince them, move faster, which was exactly what Harrington's team was already reacting against. The other option was simpler. Do nothing, not out of spite, just patience, because the client had already shared their concern honestly, and Daniel would still have the same opportunity to recognize it during the upcoming call. If he adjusted the timeline, the deal would close smoothly. If he didn't, the hesitation Laura described would become visible. Either way, the situation would reveal itself. So I made a quiet decision. I didn't escalate the email. I didn't argue in the next meeting. I simply continued doing what my role already required, preparing the documentation, updating the onboarding framework, and answering operational questions from Harrington's team. But in my notebook, beneath the last entry, I wrote one final sentence. Let the conversation happen. Not every correction needs to be forced. Sometimes the most honest outcome appears when people are allowed to follow their own assumptions, all the way to their natural conclusion. And the Harrington deal was about to reach exactly that point. The week of the Harrington closing call arrived quietly. Inside the office, the atmosphere felt almost celebratory. A $3 million contract was the kind of milestone people liked to talk about before it even officially happened. Daniel seemed especially confident. We'll wrap this up on Thursday, he told the team during the Monday meeting. After that, it's just signatures. Everyone nodded. I said very little. My role that week looked exactly the same as always. I finalized the implementation documentation, reviewed the onboarding schedule, and answered a few practical questions from Harrington's operations team. But there was one small difference. Instead of preparing only the timeline Daniel had been presenting, I quietly drafted a second version. A slower rollout. 3 phases instead of 1. More flexible deadlines for their IT migration. I didn't send it to anyone. I simply saved the document, not as a backup plan, just preparation. Because by that point, I understood something clearly. If the client pushed back during the call, the room would suddenly need a solution. And solutions are most useful when they already exist. So I kept working quietly, updating files, taking notes, watching the situation move closer to the conversation that would finally reveal whether the deal was as secure as everyone believed. From the outside, nothing about my behavior looked different. But sometimes the most important work happens in silence, long before anyone realizes it will be needed. The Harrington call took place on Thursday morning. From the beginning, something felt slightly off. Not hostile, not confrontational, just careful. Daniel opened the meeting the same way he always did, confident, energetic, walking through the final proposal structure as if the deal were already complete. For the first 15 minutes, everything sounded normal. Then Laura Chen spoke. Her tone was polite but noticeably firmer than before. Before we finalize anything, she said, our team still has concerns about the rollout schedule. There was a short pause. Daniel responded quickly, reassuring her that the timeline had already been reviewed and approved in earlier discussions. But Laura didn't move on. We understand that, she said. But internally, several departments feel the transition may be happening too quickly. Another silence settled over the call. Not long, just long enough for everyone on our side to realize something had shifted. Daniel tried to keep the conversation moving. He spoke about efficiency, about momentum, about the benefits of launching sooner rather than later. But the more he explained, the clearer it became that Harrington's team wasn't looking for persuasion. They were looking for an adjustment. And when they didn't hear that adjustment, the tone of the meeting slowly cooled. Laura eventually ended the conversation carefully. I think we may need a little more time internally before moving forward. The call ended a few minutes later. Back in the conference room, no one spoke immediately. The deal hadn't collapsed, but the confidence that had filled the office earlier that week was suddenly gone. For months, everyone had assumed the contract was essentially secured. Now it was uncertain again. Daniel stared at the table for a moment before closing his laptop. "We'll follow up tomorrow," he said, but the room already understood something important. Momentum had disappeared. And in large deals, once momentum breaks, getting it back can be difficult. No one blamed anyone directly. No accusations. Just a quiet realization that something valuable had slipped slightly out of reach. And without realizing it yet, the team was about to rediscover the one person the client had already said they trusted to continue the conversation. The day after the call, the office felt noticeably quieter. No one said the Harrington deal was in trouble, but the certainty that had surrounded it all week was gone. Daniel spent most of the morning on the phone, first with Harrington's procurement team, then with their partnerships director. From the fragments of conversation we could hear through his office door, it was clear he was trying to rebuild momentum, reassuring them, clarifying the timeline, offering explanations, but the responses on the other end seemed distant. Around lunchtime, Daniel walked out of his office and gathered the team in the conference room again. "They're reconsidering the rollout structure," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Internal alignment issues." No one looked surprised. Everyone had heard enough sales conversations to understand what that phrase usually meant. The deal hadn't been canceled, but it was drifting away from the finish line. Daniel tried one more approach that afternoon, sending a revised message to Harrington suggesting small adjustments. The reply arrived a few hours later, short, professional, and very clear. They would pause the contract discussion for the moment. Then, near the end of the message, there was one additional sentence. "If we continue the conversation, our team would prefer to speak directly with Alice regarding the implementation structure." I saw the email a few minutes later when Daniel forwarded it to the team. No comment, just the message. For a long moment, the office stayed quiet, because the implication was obvious to everyone. The person who had spent months describing me as not strong with clients had just been asked, by the client, to let me lead the most important conversation of the entire deal, not out of office politics, not as a courtesy, simply because that was the person they trusted to speak with. And by the time that realization settled across the room, there was no easy way to change the situation. Daniel came to my desk about an hour after forwarding the email. He didn't look angry, just tired. The kind of tired that comes from realizing a situation has moved somewhere you didn't expect. "Alice," he said quietly, "do you have a minute?" We stepped into the small meeting room near the window. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just looked at the email on his phone again, as if rereading it might somehow change the wording. "They specifically asked to talk with you," he said finally. "Yes," I replied. Another pause. Daniel leaned back slightly in the chair. "You've been handling a lot of their operational questions, right?" "Mostly about implementation details." He nodded slowly. "I didn't realize they were relying on you that much." The room stayed calm. No tension, no raised voices, just two people looking at the same situation from slightly different angles. After a moment, he said, "Do you think the deal can still be saved?" I considered the question carefully. "Yes," I said, "if the rollout timeline changes." He watched me for a second, then asked, "You already have something in mind, don't you?" I reached into my folder and placed the document on the table. The phased rollout plan I had prepared earlier in the week. 3 stages, longer preparation time for their IT team, the exact concern Harrington had been hinting at for weeks. Daniel scanned the pages quietly. When he finished, he exhaled slowly. "This is probably what they wanted all along." "Yes," I said. There was no accusation in the room, no need for it. Just the quiet recognition of something that had been visible for a while. After a moment, he slid the document back toward me. "Then you should lead the next call," he said. Not dramatically, just a simple conclusion. Because by that point, the client had already decided who they trusted to have the conversation. And sometimes, the clearest correction in a professional relationship doesn't come from arguing. It comes from calmly doing the work that was always there to be done. The follow-up call with Harrington happened 2 days later. It was quieter than the previous meeting. No big introductions, no long presentations, Just a smaller group on both sides of the screen. Laura Chen, their CTO, Daniel, and me. Daniel opened the call briefly, then passed the conversation to me. Alice will walk through the revised implementation structure, he said. His tone was neutral, professional, nothing dramatic. I shared the phased rollout plan and explained it slowly, not as a sales pitch, as a conversation. Phase 1 focused on preparation, giving their IT team time to stabilize their internal migration. Phase 2 introduced limited system integration with a smaller operational group. Phase 3 completed the full rollout once both sides confirmed everything was functioning smoothly. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Laura smiled slightly. This is exactly what our team needed to hear. The CTO nodded. If we structure it like this, the risk becomes manageable. The rest of the conversation moved calmly from there. Not rushed, not tense, just two teams were working through the final details of a contract that now felt realistic instead of pressured. 3 days later, Harrington signed the agreement. The largest deal our department had closed that year. Inside the office, the reaction was what you might expect. People congratulated Daniel. They congratulated the team. And occasionally, someone would stop by my desk and say something like, "Nice job on that call." I appreciated the comments. But the real change wasn't the contract. It was something quieter. After that week, the way people spoke about me began to shift. Not dramatically, no one announced a correction to the old narrative. But small things were different, sis. When new deals were discussed, my opinion was asked for earlier in the process. When clients requested technical clarifications, people suggested I join the conversation instead of waiting in the background. And Daniel stopped making jokes about my communication skills. Not because anyone demanded it, simply because the situation had made the reality obvious. The truth is, I didn't feel vindicated. There was no sense of proving someone wrong, just a calm understanding that reputations often change the same way they form, through repeated experiences, quietly. Over time, looking back now, I realized something important about that period of my career. For a long time, I thought the story was about being underestimated. But it wasn't really about that. It was about patience, about understanding that not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected immediately. Sometimes the most effective response isn't to argue for a different role. Sometimes it's simply to keep doing the work well enough that eventually reality becomes impossible to ignore. And once that happens, people start seeing you a little more clearly. When people hear this story, they often expect it to end with some kind of dramatic moment, a confrontation, a speech, a moment where someone finally says, "You were wrong about me." But that never happened. Daniel and I never had a big conversation about the past. The office never gathered around to redefine my role. No one formally corrected the comments that had followed me for months. And honestly, they didn't need to, because the most meaningful corrections in professional life rarely happen through arguments. They happen through outcomes. After the Harrington deal closed, something subtle shifted in the way people approached me. Not overnight and not loudly, just small changes in behavior. People listened a little longer when I spoke. They asked for my perspective earlier in discussions. Clients were more often invited to speak with me directly. No one framed it as a transformation, but I could feel the difference. And over time, I realized something important about the whole experience. Being underestimated is uncomfortable, but it also gives you a unique position. When people assume you aren't influencing the room, they stop watching you so closely. They stop guarding their assumptions. And that space, quiet, unnoticed, can become incredibly powerful if you use it carefully, not to prove people wrong, but to understand the situation more clearly than anyone else in the room. Looking back, I don't think Daniel was a villain. He simply believed the version of me that fit the role he had seen first. Confident salespeople speak loudly. Operational specialists stay in the background. Those categories are easy to understand. Real people are usually more complicated than that. The Harrington deal didn't change who I was. It simply gave everyone else the chance to see the part of my work they had overlooked. And sometimes that's all it takes. So, if there's one quiet lesson I took from that experience, it's this. You don't always have to rush to correct the way people see you. Sometimes the better approach is patience. Keep doing the work. Keep paying attention. Keep preparing for moments others don't see coming. Eventually, the situation itself will tell the truth. And when it does, you won't need to say very much at all. Now I'm curious about your experience. Have you ever been underestimated at work? and later found a moment where people finally saw what you were capable of?